Plato. Ancient References and Anecdotes from a Prominent Greek Philosopher by Ferdinand Gives. Narrated by Alistair Cunningham. Plato's biography. The Athenian philosopher Plato, circa 428 to 347 BC, is one of the most important figures of the ancient Greek world and the entire history of Western philosophy. In his written dialogues, he conveyed certain messages and expanded on the ideas and techniques of his teacher, Socrates. The academy he founded was by some accounts the world's first university, and in it he trained his greatest student, the equally influential philosopher Aristotle. Plato's recurring fascination was the distinction between ideal forms and everyday experiences, and how it played out both for individuals and for societies. In The Republic, his most famous work, he envisioned a civilization governed not by lowly appetites, but by the pure wisdom of a philosopher king. The Greek philosopher Plato founded the Academy in Athens, one of the great philosophical schools of antiquity, ancient times. His thought had enormous impact on the development of Western, having to do with American and European thought, philosophy. Early life. Plato was born in Athens, Greece, the son of Ariston and Perictyon, both of Athenian noble backgrounds. He lived his whole life in Athens, although he travelled to Sicily and southern Italy on several occasions. One story says he travelled to Egypt. Little is known of his early years, but he was given the finest education Athens had to offer noble families, and he devoted his considerable talents to politics and the writing of tragedy, works that end with death and sadness, as well as other forms of poetry. His acquaintance with Socrates, circa 469 to 399 BC, altered the course of his life. The power that Socrates' methods and arguments had over the minds of the youth of Athens gripped Plato as firmly as it did many others, and he became a close associate of Socrates. The end of the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 04 BCE, which caused the destruction of Athens by the Spartans, left Plato in a terrible position. His uncle, Critias, circa 480 to 403 BC, was the leader of the 30 Tyrants, a group of ruthless Athenian rulers who were installed in power by the victorious Spartans. One means of holding on to power was to connect as many Athenians as possible with terrible acts committed during the war. Thus, Socrates, as we learn in Plato's Apology, was ordered to arrest a man and bring him to Athens from Salamis for execution, to be put to death. When the great teacher refused, his life was threatened, and he was probably saved only by the overthrow of the 30 tyrants and the re-establishment of the democracy, a system of government in which government officials are elected by the people. Death of Socrates. Plato welcomed the restoration of the democracy, but his mistrust was deepened some 4 years later when Socrates was tried on false charges and sentenced to death. Plato was present at the trial, as we learn in the Apology, but was not present when the hemlock, poison, was given to his master, although he describes the scene in clear and touching detail in the Phaedo. He then turned in disgust from Athenian politics and never took an active part in government, although, through friends, he did try to influence the course of political life in the Sicilian city of Syracuse. Plato and several of his friends withdrew from Athens for a short time after Socrates' death and remained with Euclides, circa 450 to 373 BC, in Megara. His productive years were highlighted by 3 voyages to Sicily, and his writings, all of which have survived. The first trip, to southern Italy and Syracuse, took place in 388 and 387 BCE, when Plato met Dionysius I, circa 430 to 367 BCE. Dionysius was then at the height of his power in Sicily for having freed the Greeks there from the threat of Carthaginian rule. Plato became better friends with the philosopher Dion, circa 408 to 353 BCE, and Dionysius grew jealous and began to treat Plato harshly. His dialogues. When Plato returned to Athens, he began to teach in the Gymnasium Academy, and soon afterwards acquired property nearby, and founded his famous academy, which survived until the early 6th century CE. At the centre of the academy stood a shrine to the Muses, the gods of the arts, and at least one modern scholar suggests that the academy may have been a type of religious brotherhood. Plato had begun to write the dialogues, writings in the form of conversation, which came to be the basis of his philosophical, having to do with search for knowledge and truth, teachings, some years before the founding of the academy. To this early period, Plato wrote the Laches, which deals with courage, Charmides with common sense, Euthyphro with piety, religious dedication, Lysis with friendship, Protagoras with the teachings of virtues, or goodness, and many others. The Apology and Crito stand somewhat apart from the other works of this group, in that they deal with historical events, Socrates' trial and the period between his conviction and execution. Plato's own great contributions begin to appear in the second group of writings, which date from the period between his first and second voyages to Sicily. The Meno carries on the question of the teachability of virtue, first dealt with in Protagoras, and introduces the teaching of anamnesis, recollection, which plays an important role in Plato's view of the human's ability to learn the truth. Plato, Legacy and Influence. The Academy flourished for nearly 3 centuries following Plato's death, but was destroyed in the sacking of Athens by the Roman general Sulla in 86 BC. Though continually read in the Byzantine Empire and in the Islamic world, Plato was overshadowed by Aristotle in the Christian West. It was only in the Renaissance that scholars like Petrarch led a revival of Plato's thought, in particular his explorations of logic and geometry. William Wordsworth, Percy Shelley, and others in the 19th century Romantic movement found philosophical solace in Plato's dialogues. The Republic. Socrates is again the main character in the Republic, although this work is less a dialogue than a long discussion by Socrates of justice and what it means to the individual and the city-state, independent states. Just as there are 3 elements to the soul, the rational, the less rational, and the impulsive irrational, so there are 3 classes in the state, the rulers, the guardians, and the workers. The rulers are not a family of rulers, but are made up of those who have emerged from the population as a whole as the most gifted intellectually. The guardians serve society by keeping order and by handling the practical matters of government, including fighting wars, while the workers perform the labour necessary to keep the whole running smoothly. Thus, the most rational elements of the city-state guide it, and see that all in it are given an education equal to their abilities. Only when the 3 work in harmony, with intelligence clearly in control, does the individual or state achieve the happiness and fulfillment of which it is capable. The Republic ends with the great myth of in which the wanderings of the soul through births and rebirths are retold. One may be freed from the cycle after a time through lives of greater and greater spiritual and intellectual purity. Last years. Plato's third and final voyage to Syracuse was made sometime before 357 BCE, and he tried for the second time to influence the young Dionysius II. Plato was unsuccessful and was held in semi-captivity before being released. Plato's seventh letter, the only one in the collection of 13 considered accurate, perhaps even from the hand of Plato himself, recounts his role in the events surrounding the death of Dion, who, in 357 BCE, entered Syracuse and overthrew Dionysius. It is of more interest, however, for Plato's statement that the deepest truths may not be communicated. Plato died in 347 BCE, the founder of an important philosophical school, which existed for almost 1,000 years, and the most brilliant of Socrates' many pupils and followers. His system attracted many followers in the centuries after his death, and resurfaced as Neoplatonism, the great rival of early Christianity. Plato's theory of forms. Plato believed that there was only one real version of anything, the perfect version. Everything else that we see with our senses is just an imitation of this perfect version, or perfect form. The imitations we see are all part of the world of appearance, while the perfect forms are part of reality. The best way to explain Plato's theory of forms is through an example. Although there are many types of beds, single, double, four-poster, they all share one thing in common that makes them beds. They all try to achieve being a bed. The ideal bed is what all physical beds that we see are trying to imitate, making them imitations and not real forms. Plato believed in this, and believed that it is only through thought and rational thinking that a person can deduce the forms and acquire genuine knowledge. What Plato means by genuine knowledge is his idea that the world of forms is timeless, i.e., nothing ever changes, and therefore knowledge about the world of forms is genuine knowledge. Knowledge about a certain imitation of a true form, say the chair in your living room, is not genuine, as this knowledge is not timeless. The chair will deteriorate from the form you know it as, and with it, the value of your knowledge. Since the world we live in is constantly changing, Plato concludes that any knowledge we think we have is merely opinion, and is subject to change. It is because of his theory of forms that Plato believed that philosophers should rule the world, that they are the only ones who seek out true knowledge, and not just imitations of it, and so are the only ones fit to rule, based on knowledge. General views. Plato was one of the first consequentialists. He believed that it is the end result that matters, not how you get there. In his work, The Republic, he describes his version of a perfect society, where he supports the government in lying to its people in order to achieve greater happiness. This is in the context of approving of eugenics, where he invented a method of regulated sexual intercourse, allowing it only at special festivals where people are given sexual partners via a fixed lottery. This lottery would be fixed in order to trick people of good breeding stock to mate with each other and produce strong children. Furthermore, children with defects would be disposed of at birth. Plato believed that it is only philosophers who should rule over the lands. Plato believes that only people who have been proven time and time again to make judgments that are in the best interests of society, without clouding their judgment with personal interests, should be fit to rule. Plato believed that society would work better if none of the guardians, composed of the ruling class and the auxiliaries, those who help the rulers, should own any personal property. He believed that abolishing family units and replacing it with a state nursery that would seize and take care of everyone's, including the ruler's children, would be best for society, since the children would not have any family-related biases and so would be completely loyal to the state. The magnificent myth, or noble lie. In order to encourage loyalty from the people of the state, Plato devises a lie about our origins, that everybody was born fully formed out of the ground, and memories of upbringing were just a dream. In this way, all citizens are encouraged to regard each other as siblings, since they all came from Mother Earth, encouraging loyalty to each other and the land that they inhabit. The myth also includes the idea that when God created every person, he added either gold, silver, or bronze to their composition. Those people with gold were to be rulers, those with silver auxiliaries, and those with bronze workers. This meant that if two gold-composed rulers had a child who was deemed to be made of bronze, then the child was to be a worker. Plato devised this extension of the myth in order to encourage people to be happy with their position in life, which was given to them by God and cannot be changed. An example of the sort of thoughts the three elements of the soul allow: desire, spirit, reason, in that order. A just state. Plato believes that the perfect state would contain the four qualities of wisdom, courage, self-discipline, and justice. Wisdom comes from the ruler's knowledge and wise decisions. Courage is demonstrated by the auxiliaries who defend the lands and selflessly help the rulers. Self-discipline arises from the harmony between all three classes. Justice comes from everyone doing what they are naturally fitted for. The three parts of the soul. Plato identifies three elements of the soul. He uses the term soul, but this should not be confused with spirituality, or a part of someone that is separate from their physical body. Rather, Plato uses it as a general term for the thing that makes people act. The three elements are reason. This is much like wisdom in societies, and is the element that considers all of the facts known to a person and then decides what means are best to reach the ends. Reason is also concerned with the love of truth. Spirit. This provides emotional motivation and drives people to act in certain ways when they are angry, upset, etc. Desire. This drives people to act from baser urges, such as lust, hunger, and thirst. Plato states that sometimes desire contradicts reason and gives evidence of people doing what they want rather than what is best for them. He uses this as evidence for the existence of the different parts of the soul. Notice how the three elements correspond to rulers, reason, auxiliaries, spirit, and workers, desire, in a society. This exemplifies one of Plato's strongest beliefs, that the notable aspects of society are equatable to the notable aspects of individuals writ large. The best Plato books. 1. The Republic. 2. Phaedrus. 3. Apology. 4. The Symposium on Love. 5. Meno. 6. Crito. 7. Timaeus. 8. Laches and Charmides. 9. Euthyphro. 10. Gorgias. Philosophy of Plato. Plato is renowned as one of the world's greatest philosophers. Born in 429 BC, around the time of the death of Pericles, he lived for nearly 80 years up until the period that began with the birth of Alexander the Great. He belonged to an aristocratic Athenian family, who were by the standards of those days relatively rich. A large number of Plato's relatives played an active role in Athenian politics, but this was an activity that Plato himself shied away from. During his youth, he became fascinated by the teachings and thoughts of Socrates, so much so that he attended the academy that Socrates set up. Plato was only 30 years old when Socrates was killed in prison for committing crimes against the gods. Though incredibly distressed by the death of Socrates, Plato set about writing down the conversations he had held with his teacher. Today, most of what we know about Socrates, the man, and his thinking comes from texts created by Plato. Over time, he began to develop his own concepts and ideas relating to philosophy. One of his most famous works is The Republic. This is a text that describes his thoughts on how a better government could be formed than that which was in power in Athens at the time. As was common amongst the ancient philosophers of that age, he was not a fan of democracy. It was his impression that uneducated people should not have a say in electing officials that were to govern. He put forward a suggestion that the most intellectually accomplished in society should be those that hold power and make decisions. A cynic may say that due to his upbringing amongst the aristocracy, he would always suggest that the elite class should govern. Plato had a passion for the natural world and how biological systems interact and develop. He believed that all matter and thoughts had a perfect form. One of the most famous methods he used to explain his concepts was a metaphor relating to a cave. He suggested that if there was a cave inside which there were a group of men chained up against a wall and that they could only see the back of the cave and no more, all that would be visible to them would be shadows, and these shadows encompassed all reality. He proposed that if one of these cave prisoners was to escape and take in the beauty of the outside world, if he then returned to visit the remaining captives and tell them what existed outside, it is likely that he would be told that he was crazy, and perhaps even hallucinating. Plato suggested that we are all very similar to those men stuck in a cave. We believe that we know everything about the world and existence, but we are trapped in our bodies just as the men in the story were trapped in a cave. It was his mission to help people make more sense of the real world, both in practical and theoretical ways. Key concepts of the philosophy of Plato. There were philosophers before Plato, but they mostly served as tutors for children of the rich. Plato, on the other hand, decided to follow a strange, semi-homeless man named Socrates around as he annoyed people with a battery of questions that were carefully designed to reveal that they didn't know what they were talking about. His parents weren't very happy about this decision, as you can imagine, but he would be responsible for creating the foundation of philosophical thought as we now know it. Plato was the first to ask many of the questions that philosophers would be obsessed with for the next couple of thousand years. What follows is the main points of Plato's philosophy, put simply. Plato and Socrates. It is difficult to talk about Plato without talking about Socrates, and it is difficult to talk about Socrates without talking about Plato. Socrates was Plato's teacher, and he appears as the protagonist of Plato's early dialogues and his most famous work, the Republic. Socrates never wrote anything down, and so a lot of our perception of who he was and what he thought comes from Plato. What we know of Socrates is mostly as a literary character. Since Plato wrote all of his early philosophical works as dialogues, we get to see a version of Socrates brought to life, but it is Plato's version. The legend about Socrates goes that the Oracle of Delphi proclaimed him the wisest man in all of Athens. Confused by this, Socrates went around and talked to all the men who he thought were wiser than he was. After talking to them and questioning them, he found that their beliefs were full of contradictions, and when he pointed this out to them, they became upset. Afterwards, he came away with the belief that the oracle had been right. Even though Socrates was convinced that he knew nothing, he was indeed the wisest man in Athens because he knew that he did not know. This is the beginning of what we now call Socratic irony. Socrates established the role of the philosopher to question everything. Plato's early dialogues all feature Socrates engaged in debate with other characters on a number of issues. Because he constantly questioned the values of society, criticized politicians, and proposed ideas that made the establishment nervous, he was finally put on trial for corrupting the youth and for not worshipping the correct gods. Plato's dialogue, The Apology, portrays Socrates defending himself against the accusations of the state. After being sentenced, he willingly drank hemlock, saying, "I do not fear death." The early dialogues by Plato are essentially his attempt to explore the philosophical views of Socrates, though we cannot be sure how much he actually deviated from them. With The Republic, Plato struck out on his own philosophical territory, and while it still has a literary structure, with Socrates as our hero, we are seeing a systematic philosophy start to take hold for the first time. Plato's Ethics. Anybody who is interested in ethics should read The Republic. While the work touches on the ideas of Plato's metaphysics, aesthetics, and epistemology, it is essentially a work of ethical and political philosophy. The question that Socrates asks at the beginning is, what is justice? And the discussion takes us on a fascinating journey. Early in the book, Socrates encounters the character of Thrasymachus, who insists that justice is the interest of the stronger. This was a common viewpoint in ancient Greece. This was a society that valued strength above everything else, and it was Thrasymachus who held the view that it was acceptable to dominate others. Lie, cheat, and steal if one is strong enough to get away with it. The question that this brings up is, why should one be just? If being ethical led to a happier life, then there would be no problem in knowing what to do. But while Socrates rejects this definition of justice by getting Thrasymachus to contradict himself, he must still define justice and try to justify why it is valuable in itself, not just as a means to an end. A story we are given to illustrate this is the Ring of Gyges. Gyges is given a ring that makes him invisible, and the story is used to argue that no man would be just if he could commit unjust acts without being caught or punished. Explaining Plato's ideas on ethics is very difficult, and The Republic is a complex book. Plato's ethics could be best described as virtue ethics, a philosophical school of thought that is most often associated with Plato's student, Aristotle. What virtue ethics states is that the reasoning of what is moral is determined by the person, the moral agent, rather than by rules or consequences. In Plato's version of this, he contends that the human soul is divided into three parts. These parts are reason, spirit, and appetite. Exactly what these mean is under a lot of debate by different philosophers, and at times it doesn't seem as if Plato has a very clear sense of what they mean. He argues that the human soul must have at least two parts in order to explain why we have so many psychological conflicts. It could be seen that reason is our thinking ability to judge, spirit our emotional ability to feel empathy, and appetite our desires. But you will always have people who read the book and see it differently. The point for Plato, however, is that we need to balance these three parts of our souls in order to make good ethical choices. The whole point of being moral is to balance these three parts of us to keep us healthy and sane. Letting one take too much control of our minds is not good for us and leads to bad decisions. Plato's political philosophy. What is often mentioned about Plato is his dislike of democracy and the fact that he considered it mob rule. This was not an unnatural position for him to take, since it was the democratic government of Athens that executed Socrates. However, since that government did not allow women to vote and had a number of slaves, to call Athens an ideal democratic state would be an absurd statement by most people's standards. Many commentators have seen Plato's idea of the ideal government to be fascist. His defenders point out that while it may seem that way to us today, we must look at it in a historical context. Plato was thinking of his ideal government as a city-state, and this is a relatively small area where those who did not approve of the government could move to another city-state that they found less objectionable. Describing Plato's ideal city in great detail would be very lengthy, but his idea of the perfect society is radically communitarian, where every person works for the whole of society. Private families no longer exist, and the social mobility of women is greatly increased because they are no longer expected to simply play the role of wife and mother. Plato gives his central government even enough power to censor all artists. Plato contends that artists portray a copy of reality that deceives those who experience it. He goes into great detail about what art would and would not be acceptable in his new society, and such passages do not do well to defend him against those claims of fascism. This is an interesting stance, since Plato's government is based on a lie in itself. It is specifically called the noble lie, or the myth of the metals. What this myth entails is that each citizen will be told they are destined to a certain station at birth, and that their soul is matched with a corresponding metal. This is a lie that is presented to citizens in order to keep social order and assure that everybody stays within their position of society. At the top of the order are the philosopher kings that Plato feels are the only ones wise enough to rule over the city. It is worth noting that though he placed them at the top of the hierarchy, he gave them little monetary reward for their status. Wealth was always distributed within Plato's society. Plato, epistemology, and metaphysics. Another famous myth that is associated with Plato is the allegory of the cave. The allegory has been studied tirelessly, so giving my interpretation would just be one of many. It is essentially about the process of becoming a philosopher and looking beyond the surface of things. It is also worth noting that Plato was distrustful of the senses when it came to the ability to perceive knowledge. Plato knew that our senses could be fooled, and he placed an emphasis on our abilities to think and reason over knowledge gained from the study of the physical world. This leads us to another famous metaphysical idea, the theory of the forms. Plato was fascinated by the problem of universals. An example would be if I told you I had a dog. If I told you this, you might picture a poodle, or you might picture a mastiff, or a chow, or perhaps a border collie. These are all dogs, yet each one is so different in its particulars. What makes a dog have its essential dogness? Plato came up with the idea that all physical manifestations of things are imperfect. An ideal form of the thing could never exist in the physical world, but it could exist in a higher reality. This concept was extremely influential on medieval religious thinkers who found its literal idealism irresistible. While it still remains an interesting idea to discuss, modern philosophers have long since discarded it as a path to any useful knowledge. Death and Dying by Plato. The poet Ralph Waldo Emerson once remarked, "Plato is philosophy, and philosophy is Plato." No less adulation came from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who claimed that Western philosophy was a series of footnotes to Plato. These kind of acclamations give one a sense of the major importance of the thinker originally named Aristocles, who came to be called Plato because of his robust figure. Born into one of the most distinguished families in Athens, Plato, 428 to 348 BCE, seemed destined for a career in politics. This changed mainly because of the influence of his great mentor Socrates, 470 to 399 BCE, who was falsely accused of impiety and corrupting the youth, and executed by the state. Becoming distrustful of politics, Plato decided to carry on the philosophical traditions of his mentor. He founded the Academy, considered the first university in Western civilization, and wrote the Dialogues, which continue the eternal questions raised by Socrates. Plato was especially interested in his mentor's pursuit of real, eternal truths, justice, beauty, and goodness, which Plato believed had an existence beyond the mere physical world of flux and change. Accordingly, Plato developed a dualism. There is the physical and the changing world, to which the body belongs, and the permanent and immaterial world, to which the mind or soul belongs. The body is then seen as the prisoner and temporary residence of the soul, which has existed before its imprisonment and which will exist again after its release from the body at death. In this way, says Plato, the true philosopher is always pursuing death and dying. The Dialogues offer a variety of arguments for the immortality of the soul. In the Republic, Plato argues that the soul cannot be destroyed by any inherent evil, or by anything external to it. In his Phaedrus, he reasons that the soul is its own self-moving principle, and is therefore uncreated, eternal, and indestructible. And in the Phaedo, a series of arguments are offered based on the cyclical nature of life and death, knowledge the soul could only have gained in pre-existence, the incorporeal or spiritual nature of the soul, and the view that the soul is the essence and principle of life itself. The argument regarding the nature of the soul is perhaps the one that gets discussed by scholars most often. If the soul is incorporeal, it is simple or uncomposed, not made up of parts. But death is the decay and corruption of a thing into its elementary parts, decomposition. The soul, therefore, cannot die, since an uncomposed entity cannot be decomposed. The logic of this argument is compelling. However, it depends entirely on its key premise, that the soul is spiritual, not corporeal. This is a major point of contention for many, including Plato's greatest student Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE. Though he firmly believed in the immortality of the soul, Plato never considered his arguments to be conclusive proofs and recognized the need for further discussion and consideration, saying that one can only arrive at the truth of the matter insofar as it is possible for the human mind to attain it. Interesting Plato facts. One of the greatest philosophers to have ever lived on earth was Plato. His works have heavily influenced the Western culture. All his writings focused on a wide range of subjects, including philosophy of language, epistemology, cosmology, theology, discussions on aesthetics, beauty, justice, equality, and yes, political philosophy. Here are 25 interesting Plato facts, just in case you happen to love reading about famous people. 1. Plato was born an ancient Greek philosopher. He was born sometime around 428 BCE. 2. He died somewhere around 348 BCE in the city of Athens. 3. Socrates, yet another great philosopher, was his teacher, and he was, in turn, teacher of another great philosopher named Aristotle. 4. Everything we know about Plato comes from classical historians and contemporary writers. So there is actually somewhat of a debate about the year of his birth. Modern historians believe that he was born between 424 and 423 BCE. 5. Ariston was Plato's father's name. Ariston descended directly from kings of Messina and Athens. 6. Even Plato's mother, Perictione, is believed to be a descendant of an aristocrat named Solon. According to historians, Solon was a Greek statesman from the 6th century BCE. 7. According to some historians, Plato was actually his nickname, and that his real name was Aristocles. 8. Aristocles was Plato's grandfather's name, and some historians suggest that Plato was the eldest grandson of Aristocles, and that it was customary in Greece, during Plato's time, to name the family's eldest son after his grandfather. Historians don't really agree on this. Some argue that there is no definitive proof of Plato being the eldest son in his family. 9. If we incline towards believing that Plato was just a nickname, it makes some sense, because Plato actually meant someone who has a broad and strong physical build. Plato indeed had a very broad body structure. You could say he was a big guy. 10. Since Plato belonged to an aristocratic family, he received his first education from some of the finest educators who were present in Athens at that time. 11. During his education, Plato was probably taught about doctrines of Parmenides, Pythagoras, and Cratylus. These doctrines possibly molded Plato and laid down the foundations for his study of epistemology, which is actually the study of knowledge, and metaphysics, the study of nature. 12. His mother married his uncle after his father's death. Historians believe that Plato had one sister, 2 full brothers, and 1 half-brother, but they are not sure whether he was the eldest son of the family or not. 13. When Plato was young, he met Socrates, and was so much influenced by him that Plato quickly became a close associate of Socrates. 14. During the Peloponnesian War, in which Sparta defeated Athens, Plato served as a soldier between 409 and 404 BCE. 15. After the Peloponnesian War, oligarchy was established in Athens, but soon democracy was re-established. It was then that Plato considered getting into politics, but in 399 BCE, Socrates was executed, and this left a very bad impression about politics on Plato, who then decided to drop the idea of joining politics and instead turned to philosophy. 16. Plato travelled across the Mediterranean region for 12 years after his teacher Socrates was executed. During these 12 years, he learned astronomy, geology, geometry, mathematics, and religion. 17. It was during or just after his 12 years of travel, Plato started writing extensively, which is divided into 3 distinct periods. In the early period, Plato attempted to spread the teachings of Socrates through his writing. In the middle period, he wrote about his own ideas of wisdom, courage, justice, and the ideas of moderating society and individuals. In the late period, he took off his major focus from Socrates and explored his own metaphysical ideas, and even explored architecture, drama, music, and dance. 18. In 385 BCE, Plato founded the Academy in Athens, which became one of the first institutions in the Western world to offer higher learning. 19. Plato presided over the Academy until he died, but the institution continued to operate until 529 CE. 20. The Roman emperor, named Justinian I, considered the Academy to be a threat to Christianity and closed it completely. 21. The students of the Academy were taught philosophy, political theory, mathematics, biology, and astronomy. 22. Plato died in Athens in his early 80s, somewhere around 348 BCE. 23. According to some historians, Plato died peacefully in his sleep, while some believe that he died while he was attending a wedding. 24. Plato was known for writing dialogues. He strongly believed that dialogues help us to understand an individual in a better way. The Republic is considered his best work, which he wrote during the Middle Period. 25. One of the famous students of Plato was Aristotle. It was Aristotle who gave a whole new direction to Plato's thoughts. The Renaissance master, Raphael, painted a famous picture known as the School of Athens, in which he painted Plato and Aristotle. Famous philosophical quotes by Plato. Plato is one of the world's best-known, widely read, and studied philosophers. The student of Socrates and the teacher of Aristotle, Plato wrote in the middle of the 4th century BCE while residing in ancient Greece. Plato's middle to later works, including his most famous work, The Republic, are regarded as providing Plato's own philosophy, in that the main character speaks for Plato himself. His work blends ethics, political philosophy, moral psychology, epistemology, and metaphysics into an interconnected and systematic philosophy. Not only did he bring us the Republic, he brought us the legend that is Atlantis, and endless other gems of knowledge. His works are truly timeless, and out of them we have been gifted with a myriad of resonating quotes. Those listed below are just a small sample. 1. For a man to conquer himself is the first and noblest of all victories. 2. He who is not a good servant will not be a good master. 3. If a man neglects education, he walks lame to the end of his life. 4. Life must be lived as a play. 5. No law or ordinance is mightier than understanding. 6. Only the dead have seen the end of war. 7. Opinions are the medium between knowledge and ignorance. 8. A good decision is based on knowledge and not on numbers. 9. The greatest wealth is to live content with little. 10. There are two things a person should never be angry at: that they can help, and that they cannot. 11. Thinking, the talking of the soul with itself. 12. We do not learn, and what we call learning is only a process of recollection. Plato and education. Plato was the earliest and most important Greek philosopher and educational thinker. Plato thinks education is a key component of society and puts a stress upon education. For this purpose, he even wanted to go to the extreme level of removing children from their mothers in order to raise them by the state. He wanted to identify the skills of the children and give them a proper education for that particular skill they possess, so as to make them a suitable member of the society in which they could fulfill their duty. Plato sought to search for intelligent and gifted children within the society. Plato contributed a lot in the form of ideas and inspired his followers to find new ways for education and the training of children. In fact, Plato himself did not contribute directly to science and mathematics, but the stress he placed on these subjects and his philosophy of education influenced the development of these subjects in centuries to come. In the philosophy of Plato, we can see some signs of the philosophy of Socrates. However, Plato covered the major aspects of philosophy discussed today. Plato was born in an upper-class family in Athens. He was interested in a political career, but after the death of his teacher Socrates, Plato pursued his teacher's philosophy. For the purpose of education, Plato traveled to Egypt and Italy, where he learned mathematics. After returning home, he established an academy to teach moral values to the elite youth of Athens, to make them better leaders of society. Plato shows his ability of writing in different fields, in those of ethics, music, drama, poetry, metaphysics, dance, architecture, and what he believes to be the ideal forms of government. The contributions of Plato in scientific subjects are little, but his ideas on education inspired his followers to explore new dimensions in teaching. Plato writes in his book, "Let us describe the education of our men. What, then, is the education to be? Perhaps we could hardly find a better than that which the experience of the past has already discovered, which consists, I believe, in gymnastic for the body and music for the mind." Plato not only considered better education for men, but also believed in a strong body and sound mind. For the body, he recommended sports, and for the sound mind, music. Plato writes, "No man should bring children into the world who is unwilling to persevere to the end in their nature and education." Educational theories of Plato. Education for all. Plato wanted every boy and girl educated to their limit. State education. Education should be provided by the state and not by the parents. Organization and curriculum. Plato's curriculum consisted of gymnastics and music. Where in gymnastics he included physical training, and in music he used it in the broad term for drama, history, oratory, and music in the real term. He also defined different stages for the organization and curriculum. 1. Elementary school. A co-education at the elementary level and a teaching of mathematics, poetry, music and literature until the age of 18 years. 2. Military training. After elementary education, 2 years of physical education should be given to the students and select the best of them for higher education, to prepare the future guardians of the state. 3. Higher education. Higher education should be given from 20 to 35 years of age. The student will study the subjects at this stage, namely mathematics, literature, and philosophy. Later on, he would be given an opportunity at a minor administrative position to get experience for future governing positions. The object of education is to turn the eye, which the soul already possesses, to the light. The whole function of education is not to put knowledge into the soul, but to bring out the best things that are latent in the soul, and to do so by directing it to the right objects. The problem of education, then, is to give it the right surrounding. Nothing was more important to Plato in human life than education. He considers education as the greatest thing in human life, and as he mentions in his book, the one great thing. Plato's theory of education was an indispensable necessity for mankind. It was a positive remedy for the problems and operations of justice in an ideal state. Education for women. Plato also emphasizes female education. He considered the same kind of education for women as for men. Women should have the same physical and educational training. They should also know the art of war. The main aim of Plato was that each member of the society should undertake his or her work and responsibilities. Plato believed that women are equal to men, although some women are physically smaller or weaker. Some women are physically equal to men, therefore those women who are physically strong should be allowed to learn the same skills that men do. In his book, The Republic, Plato describes how males and females receive the same education and should be given the same duties in society. These people are the ones who will be in charge of his republic, which would be an ideal society, where philosophers are kings. In other words, those who know what is good for the people and for mankind, and make their decisions based on that knowledge. Teaching methods. Plato recommended a play method at elementary level, that a student should learn by doing, and when he reached the higher level of education, his reason would be trained in the processes of thinking and abstraction. Plato wanted motivation and interest in learning. He is against the use of force in education. Knowledge, which is acquired under compulsion, obtains no hold on the mind. In another place, he writes, "Do not then train youths by force and harshness, but direct them to it by what amuses their minds, so that you may be able to better discover with accuracy the peculiar bent of the genius of each." Plato writes in his Republic, "Bodily exercise, when compulsory, does no harm to the body, but knowledge which is acquired under compulsion obtains no hold on the mind." Plato also said that the most effective kind of education is that a child should play amongst lovely things. Plato wants a place where children love to go and stay there, and they play with things which enhance their education through their playing. Plato gives importance to nursery education. He thinks nursery education plays a vital role in the education of man. It is to help build his moral character and state of mind. The most important part of education is proper training in the nursery. Plato thought it would be hard to discover a better method of education than that which the experience of so many ages has already discovered, and that this may be summed up as consisting in gymnastics for the body and music for the soul. For this reason is a musical education so essential, since it causes rhythm and harmony to penetrate the most intimately into the soul, taking the strongest hold upon it, filling it with beauty and making the man beautiful-minded. The above quotations of Plato show how he sees education. He wants the total development of a man, mind, body, and soul, by using every possible means. This is why, in another place, Plato writes, "But then, if I am right, Certain professors of education must be wrong when they say that they can put knowledge into the soul which was not there before, like sight into blind eyes. He continued, whereas our argument shows the power and capacity of learning exists in the soul already, and that just as the eye was unable to turn darkness to light without the whole body, so too the instrument of knowledge can only by the movement of the whole soul be turned from the world of becoming into that of being, and learn by degrees to endure the sight of being, and of the brightest and best of being, or, in other words, of the good. Plato's aims of education: to develop leadership amongst future rulers, to develop hard and competent workers, to produce leaders with military skills among the warriors, to produce future civil servants of the state. The highest goal of education, Plato believed, is the knowledge of the good. To nurture a man to a better human being, it is not merely an awareness of particular benefits and pleasures. Stages of education. Plato describes different stages of education in his Republic. According to Plato, the education of a child should start at the age of the 7th year, and before this stage, the child should stay with their mother or elders and learn moral education from them. After the age of 6, both girls and boys should be separated, and boys should play with boys and girls with girls, and they should be taught the use of different arms to both sexes. This stage goes up to the age of 17 years. During these years, they should teach them music and early education. After the age of 17 years, the youth should be brought to the battlefield to learn real-life experiences. The 4 stages start at the age of 25 to 30 years, and in this age they get the training of mathematical calculation, which lasts for another 10 years. After the completion, the selected ones are admitted in the study of dialect. During the 5th stage, they study dialect for another 5 years, and after that, the 6th stage is one ready to become a ruler and philosopher, and to enter into practical life. Plato's view on moral ethics. Ethics is arguably the most important branch of philosophy. Plato especially gives attention to the moral and ethical education of men. Later on, Plato gradually widened the scope of his investigations by reflecting not only on the social and political conditions of morality, but also on the logical and metaphysical presuppositions of a successful moral theory. Plato presents his ideas for an ideal society in his Republic, and he provides detail about the curriculum and system of education. According to Plato, the ideal society cares for their youth, and the guardian would be responsible for the moral education of their children. Every person would know his duty and responsibility. Plato's major ideas. Metaphysical dualism. The myth of the cave. The physical and intelligible worlds exist simultaneously. The physical world is a shadow of the intelligible, immaterial. Aim of philosophy. Form of the good. Trichotomic anthropology, in that humans have appetites, which make them artisans, emotions, the spirited parts, which make them guardians, and reason, which make them rulers. The better part should rule, not a mind-body dualism. Plato could be said to have contributed to the philosophical school of the Stoics, who believed the world is ruled by wise legislation, a principle of reason, the logos. That humans have spermimatikos logos, seed-like reason. That good and evil are states of the soul. Emotions, pathos, pathological, sick soul. External circumstances bring neither happiness nor misery, whether king or slave. The main values are apatheia and virtue. Zeno is the founder, Cleanthes his student. There is no afterlife. Atomic materialism. Even the soul is made of atoms. The gods exist but have no need of humans. They are blessedly uninvolved. Therefore, there is no fear for humans. The primary value is ataraxia. Life should pass pleasantly with friendship. Eat, drink, and be merry. Middle Platonism. Posidonius, the 1st century BCE. The human body has its origins in each of the 3 parts of the universe. Reason from the celestial realm, emotions from the lunar realm, the body from the terrestrial realm. Humans have 3 natures. Gods of Greek religion have 2, emotions and reason, and the highest god has but 1, reason. Animals have emotion and bodies, and they differ from humans in lacking divine reason. Middle Platonism 3. Albinus, the 2nd century. God primarily thinks. The ideal forms are his thoughts, and they are the objects of our thoughts. The soul has 1 immortal part and 2 mortal parts. Appetites and emotions are mortal. Reason is immortal. Descent and return of the soul to the celestial realm, its origin. Plato's timeline. The ancient Greek philosopher, 427 to 347 BCE, was a follower of Socrates and was later the teacher of Aristotle. Plato formed the foundations of much of Western philosophy and provided records of Socratic teachings. Plato was born 427 BCE. Plato, the best known of Socrates' followers, was born in 427 BCE in the city of Athens. He was still a young man when his teacher died. 407 BCE. Plato met Socrates. At around 20 years old, Plato met Socrates. He took a strong interest in politics at this time. 403 BC. Plato takes an interest in philosophy. Plato, having already given up playwriting, abandoned his interest in politics for an interest in Socratic philosophy. 399 BC. Socrates dies. After the trial, Socrates was condemned to die by poison. He took the poison and died in 399 BCE. 398 BCE. Plato flees to Megara. Plato and others in Socrates' close circle fled to the city of Megara following Socrates' death to avoid potential prosecution in Athens. 398 BC. Plato travels. For nearly 20 years, Plato traveled through much of the ancient Greek world, including Egypt, Italy, Syracuse, and Sicily. 380 BC. Plato founds the Academy. In 380 BCE, Plato founded the Academy outside of Athens to teach philosophy. The best known of his students, Aristotle, would go on to have a lasting impact of his own. 367 BC, the second trip to Syracuse. Plato made his second trip to Syracuse around 367 BCE. He was in close contact with the king of Syracuse. 367 BC. Aristotle began studies. In 367 BCE, Aristotle began his studies at Plato's Academy. 361 BC. The final trip to Syracuse. In 361 BCE, Plato made his final trip to Syracuse. He had been, for some time, attempting to turn the king of Syracuse into a philosopher king. He was not successful. 347 BC. Plato dies. Plato died in 347 BCE at the Academy, where he lived and worked. 347 BC. Aristotle leaves the Academy. After Plato's death, Aristotle left the academy, moving on to found his own philosophical academy. 529 AD, Plato's academy closes. Plato's academy functioned for nearly 1,000 years, until it was closed by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. This has been Plato, Ancient References and Anecdotes from a Prominent Greek Philosopher. Written by Ferdinand Gives. Narrated by Alistair Cunningham. Copyright Ferdinand Gives, 2018.